Solomon and Smith.
Hello, you're about to listen to a conversation between myself, Jack, and David Constantine, a professor of German, translator of Faust and other German poetry of high repute. He's an author of short stories. He's himself a poet. One of his short stories was adapted into a successful film. We will not discuss the film in the conversation. What we will discuss are his translations, myself primarily of Faust, and Jack
of Hölderlin. A difficult name to pronounce.
You'll discover many things about David Constantine. For instance, he's from the north of England and learned a lot in his schooling and was moved deeply by a certain poet. I won't tell you who yet.
He was he's one of these people whose entire fate was set by the grammar school curriculum. Yeah, and his college, his Oxford College, Wadham. Which I want to pronounce Wadham.
Wadham. Saved from Christchurch, Cambridge, to be sent to the Superior Learning Institute of Wadham, Oxford.
Christchurch, Cambridge, complete hole, complete no man's land.
It is
zero repute. Everyone who has stepped foot in the halls of Christchurch, Cambridge is a fool, a dunce.
Not a single window intact. That place it has a strange stench to it.
Really strange stench. If the floors are covered with eels.
You're in a weird neck of the woods. You know when you've walked in Cambridge, it's like, oh, we turn back. It
is a contained slum of Cambridge. A hive of scum and villainy, to quote Obi-Wan Kenobi.
And it was a reference to Christchurch. This is not that well known, but Mos Eisley was a sort of representation of
Christchurch, Cambridge.
And not inaccurate for those who've been. It's not like it's really a bit too on the nose for those of us who've been around that area.
It's very interesting that Star Wars passed the censor, given how bluntly and really offensively it portrayed Christchurch, Cambridge, albeit with extreme accuracy.
Well, I think the censor of the day must have been an Oxford man. It's the only way to.
Must have been an Oxford man. Probably a Wadham College man. Christchurch, Cambridge.
Hovel.
Yeah, I maybe it doesn't exist. I just Googled it. I don't think Christchurch, Cambridge exists. That's why he couldn't go. He fell through that obvious. All state school and grammar school children who want to apply to Cambridge, they make up this fake college so that none of them will get in.
I believe it fell through the earth in the late 70s and has never been retrieved. All knowledge of it.
There is a church, a Christ Church in Cambridge.
And there is in Oxford a Christchurch, but of course we weren't referring to that one.
No, we were talking about Christchurch, Cambridge. Absolute hole.
As depicted in the 1977 movie directed by George Lucas, Star Wars. Star Wars, yes.
So we usually start these chats with a poetic epigraph. To cheer myself up, I'm going to recite... not merely the greatest of all German poems, but the greatest artifact of all German culture, which is Joachim Ringelnatz's Boomerang. War einmal ein Boomerang, war ein weniges zu lang. Boomerang flog ein Stück, aber kam nicht mehr zurück. Publikum noch stundenlang wartete auf Boomerang. Which I think is translatable for our non-German speaking listeners with the cunning use of the word boomerang. There was once a boomerang, it was a little bit too long. The boomerang flew out into the black, but it never came back. The public, many hours long, waited for the boomerang. We're probably going to structure this interview a bit freely, there's probably going to be a little Faust section, a little Hölderlin section, a little Greek epigram section. But I always like asking sort of biographical questions to start with. So, first of all, what was your childhood like, and how did you discover reading?
My childhood was in some ways a typical childhood for somebody born in 1944. My father away during the war. My grandmother's husband had been killed on the Western Front, and she was of our family. The striking thing when I look back on my childhood is just how, you can't actually say optimistic, but with the coming of the Education Act in 1944 and then the National Health Service in 47 and a Labour government in power, despite absolutely everything which they'd got immediately behind them, and that was on my way to school, the rubble heaps were still there to be seen. There were bomb sites in lots and lots of places that I played around. But the definite trajectory, unlike now, was that things with the Labour government were very determinedly to move forward and get better. And the 1944 Education Act, was to get more children into school. That is to say, not stopping school at the age of 13, as my mother and father did, but that
Mm.
they should be there for longer with better opportunities coming from that. So there's definitely, and oddly, if you like, a strong optimism.
Yeah, I suppose
Which,
you can only go up from the Second World War.
yeah,
Uh,
Thatcher did her best to shove it all back again. But that was overcome as well. And on the whole, this trajectory has been um, for the better all the way through. More children in schools and universities than would have been possible a few decades before.
do you feel that with yourself, like your access to or your path into a world of sort of literature and academia would have probably been impossible if you were born maybe as recently as like 30 or 20 years
Oh yeah,
before?
oh
Mm.
yeah, yeah. I think that would have been with the social class. My mother's side of our family were from what was known as the classic slum down in Weast and areas Cross Lane and so forth. And my father's was more in. He was not Jewish, but he was in a different area of Salford where quite wealthy people also lived, and their coming together was a strange, not
Mm.
strange. I mean, it's very fortuitous. It's one of those things. So, and they just had a lot of perhaps the majority of parents then thought it's going to be better for our children than it was for us, and they put in a lot of work to see it that happening. What's distressing at the minute is for one reason or another, actually closely international affairs, that it feels again like the opening into some terrible social collapse, not particularly or peculiarly in the United Kingdom, but I mean everything that's going on there in Israel and in Ukraine and elsewhere as well seems
Mm.
awful. Is
Yeah,
awful.
it's even if you're not a pessimistic personality, some you get sort of swept up in the zeitgeist. If you were born in the 90s, as me and Milo were, I
Yeah,
think we're both quite optimistic souls as a default. But having been born when we were, there is a sort of uh, gloom
yeah.
sort of screwed into the ego a bit.
Yeah,
When
and
yeah.
I was just going to say, true or not, a growing up period felt like one of optimism and good times, and everything is solved. The end of history was a phrase thrown around a lot at that time, so maybe the contrast is also a bit upsetting.
Yeah.
Yeah. And do you remember your first like profound aesthetic experiences when reading books, when getting into literature, reading? When were these, and what were they?
We we were encouraged. I mean, my mother and father, it's not that they'd not read a great deal. They'd read what you might have got your hands on, particularly my mother, actually, where they lived and in that social class. My father was always very anxious about his Salford accent, which my mother never was. And on the female side, my gran as well, it was absolutely broad. My dad had this awful sense, which upset me really, that he ought to be bettering himself, and bettering himself meant speaking slightly, not one. And yet the thing that they were chiefly concerned was getting us into schools, local schools,
Mm.
absolutely local schools, where a very great deal of reading was done. First of all, even in the primary school, and then certainly in the grammar school, we read a very great deal, and it was a
Yeah,
good
I
preparation.
managed to blag almost my entire primary and secondary education without reading anything, but
Yeah.
just being quite, unfortunately, very good at lying. Uh, um, but you're like in terms of books that you read for pleasure and sort of your free time. Do you remember any sort of early childhood favorites?
Um, there were fewer books when I look now at our grandchildren.
Mm,
The kind of books, and indeed our children, but certainly the grandchildren, there was more very, very good child, so-called child literature around. And there's been much, much, there's a huge, and that's the very great thing. The statistics you keep coming across now that fewer and fewer and fewer people, children and young adults are actually reading is another collapse if it's actually going to go through with from, being all the time on social media and not actually reading anything.
mm,
If I can switch to the point when I definitely knew I wanted to write poetry,
mm,
it was my school trip was from Salford on a bus and then on another bus out to the part of Manchester where I went to school. And to get there, I went through an area called, there was at the bookshop there as I came back through down to my end of town, Sheraton Hughes. And I looked in there, just poking around, and bought Wilfred Owen.
mm.
And
Did you
then
know who he was before
I'd
then?
heard of who he was, and I kind of thought this, and put it up there and went and caught my second boss and opened it then and read the first poem that was there on the sheet, and I couldn't see the page for tears.
Mm,
And that's coming across the full force of it. I don't
mm,
even remember which poem, but
mm,
suddenly I thought this is it's not what I want to do, but this is what it is. That
mm,
immediate force. And um, I've read a very great number of poets all along the way, really, and not just poets, but where I massively, massively helped,
mm,
urged, felt that I was in the right,
mm,
trying to do the thing that mattered most. I never ever have thought that poetry mattered more than anything else. Absolutely not. And the other thing about my mother's side of the family, particularly, in fact, probably both of them, was certainly that lose, losing your husband in towards the end of the First World War um, on the Somme, and they simply got a message first of all that he was missing.
mm,
And then one of his pals, the Manchester regiments were called pals regiments because it was entire workplaces that joined up together from the mills and from the factories. They all joined up, so everybody knew everybody else because they were
mm,
mates from. And it was and there were Manchester regiments, and you've got all these pals as they were called together. And one of these pals came home on leave and went to tell my gran that he'd seen um, my grandfather, her husband, blown to bits in the moving across these terrible open spaces towards Guillemont. And this whole, you know, stumbling forward, that's one of those words that comes up again and again of men in the mud stumbling forward to where they were being told to go. And then large numbers of them just not anywhere getting near the goal. You probably know this, but in Thiepval in France, there's a big white monument, and they keep adding names to it. My grandfather's name's already there. It's 32,000 plus. and those are
Mm.
called to the missing on the Somme. These are people who were never ever found and therefore never ever buried. And it's things like that. I thought um, I could talking to my gran, talking to my mother a very great deal, and to my dad as well, actually, but thinking particularly of the two women who were very great talkers. That's another thing about the
Mm.
women of that generation. They could talk and talk and talk, and they would go out shopping and come back. And my gran would just stand there and say, I said, she said, I said, she said. She'd go through the whole
Mm.
conversation, one side to the other like that. So, and
Yeah.
she could act it out. So they were great talkers, but not particularly not her, Gran. She wasn't a writer by any means, but she
Mm.
told me, particularly when she knew she was close to the end of her life, she got ever more poignant, and she brought out the few memorials that people who were blown to bits and never found were given. You know, there was a serving cross, there was a letter of condolences from the king and so forth, and she kept these very close to her, and then would produce them sometimes and show. And this is not, I hope, in any way conceited. I just felt I am the one in our family who can write about this. And that's
Mm.
not a kind of boast, or it's just a sort of um, a great privilege. It was the same for my mum was great with words in her own language, but the one who was going to write about what it was like being there and then in those circumstances with that history, I just felt, and I've said this to countless people since, who are, because every childhood is different and the circumstances are different. I've said to anybody, all people I've come across who were thinking of what it might mean to be writing poetry, and I've said, well, go first to your own circumstances and see if you can say things there that you can say better than anyone else in your family, that kind of thing, because
Yeah.
every family is different.
It's interesting to sort of contrast your attitude or feelings about the war with that of a sort of stereotype of the rest of your generation, people born in those late years. I think of, I immediately think of sort of the Beatles and,
Mm.
this whole 60s movement who sort of felt like the war was this gloomy, oppressive presence from above, and it was nice to just forget it and um, do
Well,
something sort of entirely historically removed from it.
yeah,
Yeah.
we were, when the Beatles came along, when the Stones were there and all that, that was just so important. I mean, that was just,
Mm.
as you said, really, it's like the whole thing taking off into something uh, which is not all joyous by any means, neither in any of those, but there's a force to it, which was definitely urgent and positive, and um, that young people then, without any, I mean, it just seemed this is the voice of your generation, and that was a terrific thing to as it were come into.
Mm.
Um,
When
and
when did you start learning German and reading German language poetry?
I went to Manchester Grammar School, not Salford Grammar School. The other thing to remember is that my mother and father had no idea whatsoever where the best school would be or what the
Okay.
best school would be like. It was entirely in the hands and the knowledge of the people who taught me at primary school, and then in schooling up to 15. Um, and in Manchester Grammar School, I had the most extraordinary uh, well, an education. It was a very narrow education in that once you decided, or they decided for you, that you would be doing languages, you'd be doing English, you'd be doing French and German as my thing. And then you might be doing some other thing, as it were, tacked on to show that you were a bit broader than that, but not very much. When I see what our kids have been doing, obviously in state schools, in all their schooling, it's been so much wider. And
Mm.
that's partly because the classes that our kids have been to and grown up through has been so multicultural. That's another thing compared with the effectively white the people with you in the school and the teachers and all the rest of it. So it's all changed massively for the good, really, in that sense of a very great variety. And it also became easier to see that if you just concentrated on three subjects, you were actually going to end up pretty narrow-minded. So once I'd got to a university where you're with people doing all sorts of things, then it was a great opportunity to just see that this is critically important to you and this is critically important to her or to him and so forth. And that was a huge opening. But what I should say is I only got to Manchester Grammar School, which was thought to be a better school than Salford School. My mother and father had no idea whatsoever about these things. So it's entirely done by the teachers. And when I was finishing in Manchester Grammar School, there's a guy there whom I adulated. He looked like Marcello Mastroianni. He's a very, very good-looking man. And he and his wife had been selling Libération, the left bank in Paris. And I just thought, wow, you know. So when none of us knew where we were going. He just came in and he put me down for Christ's in Cambridge. I said, I didn't even know that Oxford was broken down into different colleges. I just thought you went to Oxford. I didn't, or you went to Cambridge. The idea that was news to me, as it was to my parents, obviously. And then he came back he was teaching us all the time, and he came back into the classroom um, again, and he kind of looked at me and he just said, not Christchurch, Wadham, not Christchurch, Cambridge, Wadham. And Wadham was already a kind of grammar school college, whereas most of them weren't actually. By no means were they that.
Mostly private school kids.
They were mostly private
Yeah.
school kids, yeah.
Mm.
It's taken an awful long time. It's now somewhat more state school educated than privately educated. So it's a
No.
long way
There's
to go.
state schools from nice postcodes.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. But going back to the German language,
Yeah, I did French and
yeah,
German based, French,
yeah.
German, English.
And so when did your feelings about the German language, your experience with the German language, change from simply an academic discipline to something that you genuinely loved and felt relevant to you?
Well, we were lucky. There was school exchanges going on, and we went, at the age of 13. I was 14, 15 when I first went to the Ruhrgebiet in Germany and had a pen pal there, and he came over to us. So there was that exchange. There was a French exchange as well.
Okay.
Um, this is this is before being in the EU and then Brexit. I mean, that was just one of the things that you did. It's got extremely more difficult to fix these things up now. They were just part of the, as it were, course and curriculum that you should get across. So um, I loved equally both languages, and I did well in academically in all three, in French, German, and English. And I chose German in the end, I think, because um, we'd been well educated in German as well, and there were people on the German syllabus, so to speak, and Goethe was obviously one of them very very early on, um, but others as well, like Kleist particularly,
Mm.
and I decided for that, and I again at university I was doing chiefly one. I mean that was what I chose for. I was always in contact with. My wife Helen is not French, but she's an absolute French addict, as it were, and we go there often.
Mm.
She's Cornish. Yeah. Um,
Close enough.
Yeah, it sort of leads to one of my questions, which might have been subtly answered there, which was when did you first meet Faust? And of course, it's a complex question because there are many Fausts
yeah,
by many authors, and I wonder which was the first Faust you met, and when, if not Goethe, did you then meet Goethe's version?
it was Goethe's Faust that we began to read and study pretty well straight away in Wadham. I came to the others, if you like, Milo indirectly later, liked it very much actually. We did Faust Part 1. That was, I think, as far as I remember, that was the syllabus first of all, and then you moved on to, if you could choose special subjects once you got a certain level, and I did the whole thing then, and was just very well taught.
Were you enraptured from the very beginning with this character and this story?
Well, I think it's very difficult looking back, but I think this happens to many people. I disliked him as a character ever more, actually.
Mm.
And when I did my Faust translations, I wrote a good deal about the thorough selfishness and, well, I mean, he's a criminal, basically. He killed people, particularly, he killed people who were getting in his way. And like Philemon and Borges, I just reread that bit where he just sends the thugs in to get them out of his way. And it's that sort of thuggery and absolute indifference, really, to anybody else's, which starts with Gretchen, obviously, that you do these things. And it's like, these are all experiences. And the fact that your experience is somebody else's fatality is deeply upsetting. And I think there's been I mean, there used to be quite a feeling that Faust was a force, and that, strong men would, as it were, think that's a good thing, and it would, there'd be a bit of collateral damage, but basically you'd be pushing on to something that was valuable for him, if possibly socially valuable in some ways.
There's a kind of romantic reading of it, I suppose, where you ignore his massively unpleasant aspects, and an abstracted version of him is a bit like the romantic figure of the artist, sort of indifferent to worldly affairs and following an
Yeah,
abstract higher goal.
yeah.
Yeah.
I've never I've never felt like that, and I think actually, obviously this is one of those works where you can think this or think that, but increasingly there's quite a strong feeling that um, there's no question of with Marlowe, it's salvation or damnation. It's damnation in his case. There's really no there's really no possibility, not the remotest possibility, of Faust being damned in Goethe's Faust, because that is Goethe's view of the world. He doesn't really believe in these things, and to actually there be a heaven and be a hell, and the bad guys end up in hell is not was just it was not in him to think that. It's much more like what Keats calls the chameleon poet, and Goethe was very chameleon in that sense. He could it's being able to see into the soulness of all human beings in that kind of way. So you can be that person, as it were, um, not not literally, but you enter into them to such a degree that you espouse that way of life, contradictory though it be to other ways of life that you've already espoused. Keats talks
That,
about going into the room, and then there are all these people, and he said it's not myself. Then he just, as it were, becomes a becoming of the people around him who are particularly attractive or forceful, or and I think if that's a necessary ability in poetry, in the writing of poetry. You can't possibly do it if you can't enter into entirely other ways of being. And even if those other ways of being are distasteful or murderous or whatever, you would need to be able to imagine it.
So being so immediately opposed to Faust as a character, do you
Yeah.
remember your sort of earlier responses to the ultimate ending of Faust, in which he has sort of risen up to heaven in what may or may not be quite an ironic scene? Because you have the two endings. Part one ends mysteriously in a way. You have this kind of tragedy with Gretchen, and then Mephisto and Faust sort of steal away, and it
Yeah.
ends suddenly.
Yeah.
And given that a lot of people read only the first part, that is the ending. Many know of the ending as Faust.
Yeah.
But then we've got part two with this more magnificent ending, which seems like a forgiveness, at least superficially. Did you initially reject that ending, or was it always more complicated than that?
It's complicated, but it's very difficult to take seriously the um, notion of Faust's Unsterbliches being carried off to be among the angels and by the angels into heaven. And it's also der immer strebend sich bemüht, den können wir erlösen. It doesn't mean we have to or we're necessarily going to.
Mm.
It's within, call him God or call it whatever you like. It's within the capacity to release from the guilt this person. I think Goethe couldn't help it really, but the main strain throughout, in many respects, certainly throughout part two, is largely ironic. There's a very, very great deal of, by irony, I mean, on the, I can do this, I can do that. None of these things is quite fixed. I could be that, I could be that.
Mm.
Which is the many-sidedness of a very, very great poet. I mean, his ability to enter into other existences without any sense of, I think that's quite important to be able to enter into existences which are actually abhorrent, as well as beautiful, as well as kind, and all the rest of it.
So there's an interesting situation, as we've sort of been talking about Faust Part 1 and Part 2 as sort of separate plays, but one project. But
Yeah,
at least in the English speaking world, there is the first part is a lot more popular and
yeah,
often published independently of the
yes,
second
that's
part,
right. Yeah,
which is an interesting scenario for sort of a canonic classic. And a close-ish comparison, maybe Henry IV of Shakespeare, where part one is a lot more popular than part two.
yeah,
But I don't think those quite resemble just how different parts one and two of Faust tend to be. And what do you think it is that makes part one that much more accessible? I mean, I find part two in a way alienating, perhaps because of its irony and because it goes so far out on a limb, forgetting maybe the simple tragedy and the conceit that we open with. I mean, at the end, we do get that wager mentioned again after everyone's
yeah,
forgotten. He
yeah.
says the exact line, but that does seem to be quite far off from the shore.
Well, it's wager not pact, isn't it? As well, there's all this quibbling about on not quite letting himself in for these things. The Gretchen tragedy is a folklorish thing that kept on happening, the seduction of a girl and then her, in her case, killing her child and being beheaded. Um, that's what happens. It's one of those things that's thought, this is the way of it. But it's Faust's fault. It's Faust's doing, and obviously, what if you even at the if you're at that point, even thinking of where else is this man going to go? It's this, to me, distasteful notion that I can't be weighed down by what I've done. I can't be held back by it because living is longer than that, and there are other things I want to do and places I want to be. And a lot of it, I mean, there was a long gap between one and two, and it was, I think, chiefly moved on to, well, Schiller kept urging him to continue it, but also being in Italy, the journey to Italy was a huge sort of alteration in his, well, not alteration, but extension, sort of widening of his understandings, because he'd been basically been a sort of civil servant for the in Weimar, and he didn't even tell his boss. He just suddenly pushed off to Italy and told him when he was there. once he was there. And he's very, very susceptible in a very good way to environment of where he is, what the way of life is there, how people are there, and they're manifestly different in lots of ways. They're all human, but they're very different from what he'd been increasingly experiencing as rather enclosing atmosphere of Weimar.
And why do you think the second part has failed to catch on quite as much in the English-speaking world? It is the wider and more ambitious work. So in a way, you might expect it to have the greater reputation.
It's just in some way. I mean, it took me longer to translate, but I can perfectly well see why you wouldn't want to carry on reading it, because it is so many-sided, and there is an irony, and the irony means, on the whole, I'm saying this and kind of not quite believing it, or holding up two possibilities, and the whole thing keeps on doing that. And the ending is in many ways risible, just taking the soul of Faust up to heaven. You can imagine that being done as pure farce, and that's one of the things which distressed other people, readers in Goethe's own time, of him being actually something of a he didn't really mean it. I mean, that's what, or
Yeah.
he reserved the option not to mean it to himself, quite mean it, quite believe in it.
Whereas the ending, I mean, a lot of the drama in the first part is quite intimate and in a way that could be related to this sort of romance with Gretchen, then him deciding perhaps not, and being on the edge of this, quite a realistic decision, psychologically speaking. Then you begin part two with the mind wipe, and suddenly everything is a lot more outrageous and a lot more alienated. And I suppose even literally Goethe writing from his home in Germany somewhere, and then from somewhere else, he's in a classical world, he's outside of himself.
Yeah.
And perhaps it's just a simple question of people prefer to be closer to these characters than further away. And in the first part, you can understand Faust as maybe a redeemable figure. Ultimately, he fails the challenge, but the tension is, will he fail the challenge? Whereas in part two, I'm not sure there is really any chance of him coming back because he's so far removed from anything we're familiar with.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah.
So early. Oh, go on.
No, so I mean, it's often pointed out. I can't exactly remember where and in which scenes, but Faust is actually absent for long periods, or he's asleep, or the actual pantomime, so to speak, is going on without him. Whereas the whole of first part is or he's the key to the whole thing, he and Gretchen that's what it is about. Whereas later in the other thing, then there's so much going on that he's, as I say, he's just the observer of, or he's actually absent from, and it's a strange.
Yeah, and an interesting point when I was reading the first part was after sort of being granted this great opportunity with Mephisto to essentially do anything, become anything, and with some meddling with the sort of love potion or the attraction potion, it seems that the very first thing Faust really desires is to be with a very ordinary girl, which in a way is just something he could have achieved without Mephisto, the most ordinary desire in the world. And it's in fact the presence of Mephisto that in a way limits him and says he can't stay like this because she fears him and he's taken off to all of these wondrous events on mountaintops. And there seems to be some great irony there that when given, he's this depressed sort of scholar who believes he's read enough books, there's nothing else in his life. And all it really takes is just seeing a young girl falling in love to become completely enraptured with the universe. And I wonder if really there is the irony there, suggesting that Faust, while thinking he'd done everything, hadn't even tried the most simple aspect of human existence and encounters it completely the wrong way around.
more than once, I think, Goethe talks about incommensurables in his
Mm.
in his work. That is to say, there's this, and they don't actually fit. And it seems to be a way of being in the world, actually, to accept or even create incommensurable situations. Um, so it is not wholly this and it's not wholly that. It's a bit of this and a bit of that, and there's obviously very great tension in that, and in some ways a degree of um, well, puzzle. No, not puzzle. Puzzle's not the right word, but you can accept that the world is full or life is full of incommensurables, and that's actually not a bad way of looking at it, because not everything fits. In fact, most things don't fit.
Yeah, and I think it was Harold Bloom who compared Goethe with William Blake and rated Goethe a little higher on the same ladder. And it's Blake who talks about the contraries
Yeah,
in A Marriage of Heaven and Hell, about the contraries generating energy. And I suppose, and you get this in Blake a lot, perhaps due to just the way he would write his prophetic works, not necessarily referring back. There's a lot of repetition, a lot of sort of codes. But it's interesting to have that idea of contraries and then to apply it formally. So it's actually the work itself, not only in its content, but the actual structure. It has contradictions. It's written in the wrong order. It's pushed together. And I think that's a curious detail. And I wonder what your thoughts are on Goethe's editorial position. He could have gone back, I suppose, and caught out the contradictions and flattened them, but he didn't, and they remain in the text. And I wonder, was this a sort of refusal to edit the younger Goethe's work, or was it integral to him? He's like, it doesn't matter if we've reordered it. It doesn't matter if we have this sort of a remnant of the earth spirit, who it seems originally
yeah.
gave Faust to Mephisto, but now doesn't. Why do you think he was reluctant or refused to make those changes to make the work more unitary when looking back?
Well, I don't think in the end, well, not even in the end, he was interested in having everything made into a unity. I think his view of the world was there is precisely an incompatibles called. I mean, the surely that is surely a view of the world which is completely tenable. We live in also, and it's in many ways it's more obviously worsening now. That is to say, to what human beings are anymore. What a human being is if it's not as a robot. And once we're facing up to that, and we're facing up, but it just seems to me to be now increasingly a fact. If you go to Google and you look something up, it's an AI thing that has prepared this little bit of knowledge for you. And I suppose the younger generation faces that or thinks nothing much of that anymore. But I actually find it rather disconcerting because it's a. So I think that is. I read something. I was reading something the other day just about how long has the human race got left, and it's in larger understandings of time. The answer is not very long. It's because of the well, one of the things was that Homo sapiens, so called, is the survivor of several, in fact, many different versions of being human, of human beings, and they all die out or are all killed off by Homo sapiens. And as soon as you've got one species left like that, then it's very great. This is why we perpetually need things to keep us going, because you become absolutely open to all kinds of viruses and everything else. If you've got a mixed population, the viruses in it can circulate and they're less telling to the one that's the only one there. And we are now the only one of that species left, which is a solitary position. And obviously, it's not going to happen tomorrow, but that is, and then relatively speaking, in terms of time, it will have been a very brief interlude in which this very strange creature existed.
And I suppose a sophisticated human consciousness is something which transcends any mere biological classification of Homo sapiens. Um, I was interested when Milo brought up Blake in um, one of the interesting overlaps between Goethe and Blake. I thought was the capacity to come up with these pithy, epigrammatical
Yeah.
rhyming couplets. It's one of the things that makes Goethe distinct from Shakespeare, say. The capacity to come up with these once heard, forever remembered little rhyming couplets that can be taken out of Faust
Yeah.
and can survive alone. I mean, off the top of my head, ich bin ein Teil von jener Kraft, der stets das Gute will und stets das Böse schafft. Er nennt's Vernunft und braucht es nur allein, um tierischer als jeder Tier zu sein. We have like immediately compressing so much into a small statement, and you find this in Blake a lot. I'm curious in your translation of Faust, did you did you try to retain those little rhyming couplets
Oh, yeah.
as rhymed?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I rhymed when he rhymed, and the
Okay.
other meters, I followed him as closely as I could.
Mm,
And rhyming, as soon as you allow yourself rhymes that are half rhymes, and you're going to use A, E, I, O, U, but as long as it
mm,
matches in that sense, then that because rhyming is difficult if you're going to stick exactly. I know this from Hölderlin even more. If you stick
mm,
exactly to these very full rhymes, then you've got very, very little to play with. And if you do that, then you're actually reducing him as he appears in your own native tongue. So
mm.
um,
Yeah, I've been in my translations of Eichendorff at the moment. I've been in which I've also been rhyming in exactly the same places he rhymes and taking exactly the same rhyme scheme that he rhymes. I've been enjoying some of the chaotic, sort of unexpected things that get thrown up just by needing to rhyme. I mean, you end up you have to sacrifice certain other aspects of the poem, for example, diction and meter sometimes, and vocab choices in order to retain rhyme. But I've been really enjoying some of the strange, unexpected, beautiful bursts of rare vocabulary that
yeah.
I've had to sort of employ in order to retain the rhyme. Did you, in your translation, in any of your translations of Hölderlin, of Goethe, of Brecht, have a sort of music to meaning ratio when you're translating? Do you, if you discover something beautiful which maybe diverges from the original meaning strictly, do you feel inclined to follow it or to restrict yourself?
On the whole, what I'm doing now, I mean, I've did a lot of Hölderlin, but it was Hölderlin from Suzette Gontard right through to the end. And
Mm,
what I'm doing now, as it were, late in the day, is going right to the beginning, to the very early ones, and all these school ones, and then in Tübingen. Um, and they're harder to do in lots of ways because
mm,
once he's moved over to classical meters and they're not rhyming, then funnily enough, it is actually because German meter is heavier per force than is English
yeah, you
meter.
really know a stressed syllable in
Yeah,
German, or
so
yeah.
you can. There's more elbow room doing Asclepiads and all the and all archaic particularly. But when these really are um, his endless the trochees of early Hölderlin,
Mm,
that's very very heavy indeed, and you can't
mm,
actually easily get out of it. And if you did really try to rhyme on the rhymes always purely, and I've stopped trying to do that for years in anything that I've been translating because it's it's very hampering. Uh,
mm,
re it reduces your possibilities clearly, but also in my own poems, I very readily and often rhyme half rhyme. And it just simply means that there's something that is going on here, which is a regularity, and that is good. It's a good thing to have structures, but the leniency you allow yourself is to, um, well, it's a license. It's a small one, but I mean, half rhyme is an absolute commonplace. And so,
I suppose it's different poet to poet. Which constraints are constraints, and which constraints are actually liberating.
yeah,
And so, some poets, as soon as they have to write in iambic pentameter rhymed couplets, suddenly feel released to say
yeah,
anything they want.
yeah,
Other poets find this impossible to live within, and they find their voice in a complete breakdown of form.
yeah,
And one of the things that interests me about Hölderlin, especially because I'm reading so much Eichendorff at the moment, is just how difficult it is, how strange, like the grammar, the syntax.
yeah,
When I first read Hölderlin about 2 years ago, I just assumed my German wasn't good enough to follow his, colossal sentences and their absurd grammar. And after reading your English translations, I realized it isn't a foreign language issue. Hölderlin simply just wrote a lot, which is quite difficult to follow semantically. Are there still things in Hölderlin which you still don't quite understand?
Oh yeah, sure. But I think there's a not understanding which is actually quite productive.
Definitely, yeah.
Mm. And
Mm,
I was thinking then precisely if you know what you do, I'm sure. But what Hölderlin put himself through to be able to write like Pindar is
mhm,
this manic, absolutely syllable by syllable exactness of the odes that he was doing in that fashion. Now he's no fool. He wasn't just doing that because he couldn't think of anything better to do. He was doing that to by bringing himself literally as close as possible to what the thing was on the page.
mhm.
And those things are extraordinary because for most of the, not most, but for large stretches of their reading, they're completely unintelligible
Yeah.
without the Pindar being there. But every now and then, doing exactly that, he arrives at something which is readable, intelligible as German, but nearly off the scale of strangeness.
Mm.
And it's that he wants.
Yeah,
It's this estranging of his own language, his beloved language, into something which will be able to say even more. And then it's not clear what he wanted to do with those. He never tried to publish them. And it seems to me to be one of those exercises that very great poets are prepared to put themselves through to see what can be done in their own tongue.
mm,
Because, and he is a terrific extender of the possibilities in his own German tongue, actually.
mm,
Um, and when Goethe and Schiller made fun of him when they were reading um, his translations from Sophocles,
mm,
um, that is actually, with all possible respect, just because they hadn't understood it. They did
mm.
not know what was going on the page. These great writers, could not themselves open them up to what Hölderlin was continually doing, opening himself up to what is strange.
Yeah, there were bits and I've not read Hölderlin Sophocles, so I don't know how precisely you were how precise your translations were, but it almost sounded like Gertrude Stein or something. It was just completely out there. I have one sentence here from Antigone, which I read so many times from the very start, and just couldn't follow the grammar, but in kind of a way that's interesting, in
Yeah.
a way that was like Gertrude Stein. It's not one sad work, nor any error, and no disgrace, and no dishonor anywhere is there that I in your and my unhappiness have not seen. that
Great.
I put next to it a sentence from from the very first Sherlock Holmes story when Holmes has a letter and uh, he says, the man who wrote this note is clearly German. Do you note the peculiar construction of the sentence? This account of you we have from all quarters received. A Frenchman or Russian could not have written that. It is the German who is so uncourteous to his verbs. Reading your Hölderlin, I similarly felt that frequently that one could tell the poems were from another language, that you weren't attempting necessarily to be idiomatic and English in your sentence constructions. Was this something conscious? Were you trying to make your readers aware at times that these poems were being translated?
Well, the only leniency I really gave myself was to, it's different doing the rhyming ones, but once he'd stopped rhyming, and then again when he begins it right at the end of his life, then I was quite strict about rhyming, even if they were half rhymes. But when I was translating the, well, Autumn Vine and those in you know, in actually regular meter, then they were relatively easy. But it's the Pindar ones, not the real Pindar ones, but the odes in the end, the ones which he is chiefly um, uh, renowned for. Actually, that's a real breakthrough into something which is well, helpfully foreign. I think that's what he was always trying to do, is to make the language sound, yes, this is German, but it's foreign, and the foreignness is a good thing. So I made sure that everything was in it that he was saying. I didn't break the lines where he did necessarily, but what I knew I had to do is keep every ounce, if that's the correct word, of tension in it, because when you in fact it's the same in the elegies, you'll run on like that and like that and like that and that like that, and it's because something is pending and is coming in. It's part of the way German language makes its structures. You can actually do that relatively easy because something is coming at the end, which is more unusual in English. But I think that that is actually a very great thing. If line by line by line, you are proceeding in a way which is increasing tension in you, not waiting to see what's coming, but actually knowing there is something. And that in the German syntax can more easily be kept towards the end than it can, normally speaking, in English. So that I knew I was verfremden my own language to some extent, but I thought it was more so in my translation of the plays, perhaps even more strange.
Translations of translations,
Yeah.
somewhat eccentric. Yeah, yeah.
It seemed to me to be, English is one of the things we're definitely blessed with, is an English tongue which for centuries, in fact more than centuries actually, goes right back to mix, to French, normal French and Anglo-Saxon. So that's why you've got, as you know, in the dictionary, often you've got a Latinate word and an Anglo-Saxon word, and they're thought of as synonyms, and they are synonyms. They mean not the same, but they're not the same because the tongue they've come out of has got a slightly different it's got a sound to it, but also sometimes it's to do with plus. If it's more Latinate, then it's more.
Yeah, Latin, it's fancy. Yeah, it was interesting when I was learning Italian that whenever like you notice lots of words, but from the fancy vocabulary part of my English brain,
Yeah.
I find it's interesting with neologisms as well, comparing it to German, that British, like a word like television takes a Greek and and a Latin root, puts them together, where our German cousins it's just lit in their own tongue, Fernsehen,
That's right.
distant sight.
Yeah. No, English is very capable of that. It's a great taker in of things, and more and more and more, because there are more and more languages now actually taking place in the United Kingdom. So
I wonder if you're just to break in on that point, just if the procedure for the translation of Faust was a little different, because I did notice reading it, there are some sort of idiomatic English phrases make their way in. Words like hurly-burly.
yeah.
I think MC briefly is mentioned, which seems not to foreignize the text, but to sort of make it more familiar. And I wonder what the approach there was.
I don't think I was thinking of foreignizing Faust at all, really. I was trying to get it into a language which would be readable with pleasure. That is to say, not constantly coming up against things which just don't sound like one thing or another. Whereas with Hölderlin, particularly with the hymns, and certainly with all the fragments at the end, knew that I'm in a zone of strangeness there. And last thing I would want to be doing is making it sound more accessible or more as though this was the ordinary, because it manifestly isn't the ordinary. He was not in any way ordinary. He wasn't from the start.
Mm.
And
Yeah, that's it. Well, it creates an interesting kind of line. If sort of the more ordinary speech in Goethe is therefore rendered as something familiar to an audience, whereas the strangeness of Hölderlin can just be expressed by making it more German in English.
Mhm.
So you're sort of working on a different axis there. Goethe
yeah,
becomes accessible just by making him, giving him some of our friendly words. Whereas what you,
Hölderlin
yeah,
remains very German. Yeah.
and just being German is enough to sort of give it an additional step of
Yeah.
distance.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah,
um,
in our Robert Alter interview, translated the Hebrew Bible, he said at times there were times when he preferenced unusual wording, one-to-one idiomatic translations, for example, just to make the text sound foreign because it's thousands of years old. It's this
yeah,
it's written in the Middle East, some of it in the Iron Age. It shouldn't sound like idiomatic modern English.
yeah.
It shouldn't sound like the ESV. You're now or like recently have been translating similarly old poems, these epigrams
Yeah.
from the Greek Anthology.
Yeah.
Could you talk a bit about how you came to this project and how you came to Greek at all, actually?
Well, I was very, very lucky in being in Wadham, actually. When I started Hölderlin, I knew that I wanted in some way or other to be able to read Pindar. That was never going to be fluent exchange, obviously not. Um, but I went to the provost in Wadham College when I was there was Sir Maurice Bowrer, who was a classicist.
Hmm.
Um, and I don't know, there were these sherry parties, which I was not terribly good at, but he was exceedingly kind of benign, or he was not, he was never an off-putting person. And he had a funny way, he said, what are you doing? What are you doing nowadays? What are you doing? I'd tell him I'm doing Hölderlin and I wanted to understand more about Pindar. And he said, come and see me, come and see me. So I went round to his dwelling there, and he got the complete Hölderlin edition in German there for a start. Um, and then he talked about Pindar with me and understood perfectly well what Hölderlin had been doing.
Hmm.
And he had Bauer was gay, and for a while he was in the gay scene in Germany in the 1930s. And one of the things he just kind of flung in when we were having our conversation was, hanged my friends, hanged them with piano wires.
Hmm.
And that was the Stauffenberg plan and all plot and all the
Hmm.
rest of it. So he was very, he was kind of Germanophile. And then there was this that had come through, but he was with his Hölderlin. And he told me a good deal about Pindar that was very, very helpful. And I started at that point. I can't really say learning because I didn't go to classes. I did it myself, but I copied out most of in fact, probably all of the Iliad with the Greek. I wrote the Greek out.
Hmm.
And but the bit underneath that, I wrote an English version, keeping as
Mm.
close as I could in the Hölderlin way to where the various bits and pieces were fitting.
Mm.
So I've been doing that for quite a long time without ever wanting to call myself, I wouldn't call myself a classicist in that way. The crucial thing happening was my reading Brecht's Arbeitsjournal when he was abroad, when he was in exile. He kept these notes the whole time about where he was. It was, as you know, he had to get out in 1933. He was in hospital. His wife came and said, "If we don't get out now, you're dead." And that was true. They just got across the border in time after
Mm.
before. Otherwise, he wouldn't have existed longer than that, 33.
Mm.
Um, anyway, Brecht was in exile then from 33 right through till 47. First of all in Svendborg, and then moving up. The closer the German armies got, or once war was declared, then he moved further and further away, and was for a while in Finland before he made it out through Russia, where he'd no wish, the Soviet Union, no wish to stay because they were already killing lots of friends of his.
Mm.
Stalin was. So he got out through Vladivostok to to America on the west coast.
Mm.
And in Finland, on his birthday, his son gave him a very, very abbreviated copy um, of the elegies,
Mm.
um, of what I've been translating there, the Greek Anthology, right?
Yeah.
Very, very thin. And
Mm.
he opened it and started reading it. And it was one of those moments with Brecht, because he was a great one for changing his style according to what was going on. And he
Mm.
saw there exactly what he wanted, more and more wanted, just to say the sowness of things
Mm.
without any flummery or, you know, further ornation in any way whatsoever, but just the thing itself, solid objects, because an awful lot of those in the Greek anthology they're about tools, they're about weapons, they're about activities of one sort or another. They're about very precise places. And it's that precision and um, well, being able to say a very great deal in a very small parcel.
Mm.
It was kind of materially present. That's what he really liked about it. This is the materially present thing in that form on no other form.
Mm.
And then I bought the Greek anthology. There's only one copy extant, and that's in Darmstadt. Darmstadt. Anyway, there's just
Heidelberg, I
Heidelberg.
think. Yeah.
There's just one left of the copy of.
Mm.
I mean, they were always doing others, but the one that's called the Greek Anthology is there and has been then, distributed in many, many ways, Loeb and so forth. And I just
Mm.
started reading, going up, to, not even reading in the right order, but he's flicking through and seeing and hitting again and again and again on things which were being succinctly said and very beautifully said. And I started translating those, not, but in rather in the way that Brecht did. That is to say, in some of them I made into Greek meters, but the greater part of them were rhyming A B A B or A
Mm.
B B A or whatever like that. And it was
Mm.
just this kind of solidity of the thing.
Would you be able to read some of them to us?
Quite a lot are anonymous, which is nice. And once I realised how many were anonymous, I did ones of my own and called them anonymous. Mm. This is anonymous and not me, I think. Anonymous. Two joined that day under one roof that night, lying in the wedlock darkness, had begun to see how much their lips and hands could bring to light, how slow and lovely long their learning curve would be.
Like the end of Daphnis and Chloe. Yeah.
Um, Simonides. This bow, retired from pitiless war, and now slung here under the roof of Athene's temple, its arrows were dispatched through the dense thicket of the fight, and entered men, and lodged, and bled them white.
Bled them white.
Yeah.
Oh.
Oh, the one I like because it's about writing letters, really. Palladas of Alexandria. Nature, loving the rules that bind true friends, invented means to help in the state of absence. Pen, paper, ink, our handwriting. Love sends signals by these, pining in the distance.
Hmm.
Yeah, I'm fond of these.
Yeah.
What I tried to do was not just, well, I did them in order. No, I didn't. I flitted to and fro. And the book itself then was a sort of, I made a kind of kaleidoscope out of it where one, they didn't come in sequence, but one set next to another, set next to another. Well,
Yeah.
and then if you shake, you can't do it with a book, but if you shook the kaleidoscope, there would then be another sort of grouping of these small and Brecht just loved the succinctness of it, and he wrote a great deal in that, particularly, incidentally. You probably know the book he published at the end of his, finally was allowed to publish in the GDR at the end of the war was this Kriegsfibel, which is
Don't know them.
yeah,
Mm.
I managed to buy a copy of that in Berlin for something really quite little.
I'm actually quite unfamiliar with Brecht outside of song lyrics.
Yeah,
I love the operas,
yeah.
the viol operas, and probably know quite a lot of him by heart, just
Well,
by extension.
Fibel is a learning book.
Okay,
And
yeah.
it shows, so Kriegsfibel is these are the things you need to know in a war.
Okay.
And Brecht was also a great cutter out and hoarder of things from newspapers and
Mm.
magazines in all languages. He photographs, pictures that he
Yeah,
could get his
didn't he
hands
didn't
on.
he like write little poems next to news articles? I think when I visited the Brecht House in
Yeah,
Berlin, they had some of them there.
that's right. And the format of this book is it's all black and white. It's a black and white picture, and then underneath it, a four-liner.
Mm. Yeah.
So you then get this interplay of picture plus text. Um, and think I gave an example of that in my forward here. Yeah, this one. So this is me translating Brecht, and it's the quatrain, and above the quatrain are four photographs of afflicted children: Greek, Russian, Sicilian, and French. And the text, the four lines are, as it were, spoken by them. So these children in a bad state, you can see the bandages on them and how they've been hurt. You in your tanks and bombers, warriors, sweating in Algiers, freezing in Lapland's ice, coming from 100 battles as conquerors, we are the ones you conquered. Oh, rejoice. I've done quite a lot of similar things since. This is quatrain for a primer of our times in the back of it.
Mm.
It says supply your own pictures. So you could easily do that.
Mm.
There's one here, laws of war. We too had laws of war. Don't poison wells. Don't fell the olive trees. They take so long to grow. Don't bomb the schools. Don't bomb the hospitals. Stranger, seeking our monument, look around you.
Mm.
This is the Gulf War. That one was where we are now in Palestine. This is one from the Gulf War, really. Epitaph. We pile here in the usual ratio of us to you. So numerous in death, none has a stone and script. to lie beneath. This cicatrice, this bulldozed trench must do. And then immediately under that is fact. The fact is, friend, we matter more than you. One husband, lover, son, father of ours outweighs at least 100 such of yours. It's a fact of life, my friend, and of death too.
Mm.
It seems very interesting that your early years were very much the sort of seed that flowered into your whole career. I just thought immediately back to the war poets with whom you had your first sort of ecstatic experience, and that seems to have fed through into your recent work, and indeed, at least in a popular way, was a sort of turning point in how war is represented in poetry. No longer the kind of, I don't know when the last celebratory poem about war was written, but not after that one. And so this is the new tradition, which you can then line up with that kind of a ancient Greek view of the bow that makes pale the dead man, but sort of meant in a positive way. It's a good bow,
Mm.
did its job. And if you
It's
read
precisely
the
that. Yeah,
you read
yeah,
the Iliad, which is savagely violent,
yeah.
and I think there's room in there to think maybe some of this is gratuitous, but also a lot of it is just, well, look at this. This is exciting. This is
Yeah.
described graphically,
Yeah,
and it's what Pope gets out of the Iliad, I feel, in his very loose translation, but
yeah,
that kind of
yeah.
vivid imagery. But now it's turned against itself. Now we read it and we can't help but feel a subtext that maybe wasn't intended to be there.
Yeah.
Simone Weil kind of convincingly reads the Iliad as an anti-war
Yeah.
poem, yeah, I suppose it's hard for us because probably just due to the growing up in the ginormous echo of the Second World War behind you the entire time. It's hard to understand why someone could love gore and bloodshed as a means of expression. Um,
In those the things that the Greek Anthology, what Brecht admired about that is just the sowness of things. And when there quite a lot that are just about weapons and weapons being hung up in a place where they well in being hung up for something offered to the gods.
mm,
And then there were women died in childbirth endlessly in those, and there were these little monuments to them, and there were the big one is sons going onto the seas endlessly to and fro across the Aegean on business that to bring home food and stuff, and never turning up, and then yeah, and then a whole kind of area on the hilltops, on the headlands, that were just empty tombs
mm,
because the sons hadn't come back. And from that, there's this adjunct, which is that if a sailor washes up on your shore, it's your religious duty to bury him. So they could think that their son, if he has drowned and has turned up anywhere within the Greek zone, he will be properly buried.
mm.
Um,
It's
there's a
it's in,
thing in,
it's
sorry.
it's interesting how your like your means of responding to the causes of pessimism, chaos, war, social distress is to look into the past, into the deep past, into a time and place somewhat abstracted from you, uh, linguistically, socially, culturally, to find an adequate means of speaking about these things. Um, it's not really a question. I find it interesting that the way to talk about um, the difficult things that are around you is to look at to look far back to a very remote time and place and group of writers and
Yeah.
poems.
If you don't mind, I'll just,
Please,
you're quite
please.
right about that. There's this chorus from Sophocles' Antigone, this is Hölderlin's version, my translation of it, which I've done more than once. Um, the Hölderlin begins, ungeheuer ist viel. And ungeheuer means either monster or it means something upsettingly not geheuer, meaning
Yeah.
not easy to handle.
Mm.
I translated that with monstrous.
Mm.
Monstrous, you see, ungeheuer is feel, and then he goes on oddly to write about man, what man can do and what man should do and hasn't done and so forth. But
Mm.
so I was deliberately shifting this further into precisely what you've said, which actually seems to me where we are now in certain zones of this earth. Monstrous, a lot, but nothing so monstrous as man. For he, unkind to his own kind, inducting them young into dealing and war, dying, bequeathing them the developing curse of his enterprise, on the earth, on the seas, and into the air, he visits himself, at best in folly, but often with malice aforethought. Man, the wrong turning, who ordered the fire of the sun into the streets, the parks, and the schools of a town, and there in broad daylight cast people as lasting shadows, for him on whose brow is inscribed, beware, there is nothing I will not do. Why now should the warm-blooded dolphin, the smiling, the playful, the dancer, the maker of music, who ferried the singer Arion to safety, why now should this friend intercede? O man, the killer, who multiplies, who schemes in his sleep after ways of living forever, who smothered the law in his heart, in these days of the melting poles, of earthquake and flood, and the cavalry charge of the tides, he knows it now, the law, by virtue of having transgressed, and will stand on the shore as the leaden waves for his comfort deliver him carrion, starfish and whales. Oh, swiftly climbing and fouling the lovely curve of the sky, the infinite swarm of death will fall on his fields, and he will have nothing to answer the child who asks, who are they passing on the last of the light? They are Persephone in rags, leading her blinded mother by the hand, seeking an entrance to preferable Hades. And that's, I wouldn't have written that, but for Hölderlin, and Hölderlin wouldn't have written it, but for Sophocles. Mm,
Hölderlin feels this continuity with ancient Greece. It comes up constantly throughout his work, how he feels more at home in this remote, mostly imagined culture
yes, indeed.
than he does in his own Germany. Sometimes he can love a kind of Germany, but again, a Germany of the imagination,
Yeah.
one that
Well, there's a lot
fulfills.
in, yeah, that's
Yeah.
right. I mean, he's born in 1770. He's a revolutionary. He's Wordsworth and Hegel and a lot of that generation. And in the Tübinger Stift where he was, there was a great sort of ferment. And people kept coming to stop it, to put these kids down, but they knew precisely what sort of world they wanted to live in. It was like Wordsworth's. Bliss was at then that dawn to be alive, and
Yes.
this feeling of something is, and then it was
Yeah.
crushed.
Do you feel a sense of continuity between that generation and your own? It seems that a similar sort of dizzying optimism of the 60s falling under sort of a hammer of sort of disillusionment.
I don't feel disillusioned, and
Mm.
the friends that the friends we've got very good friends. We've lost a lot en route. I don't mean lost their friendship because they're dead. But we've got a family with grandchildren and now a great grandchild. And if you look at them, then I kind of, it is there in them, this sort of ebullience about life of what, because there are an awful lot of things they can do now that we couldn't do, an awful lot of measures in place. I know it doesn't work all the time, but the safeguarding of children, looking after a generation, trying to bring them on into into not just being good citizens, but being people who will enjoy themselves in their own country. So I don't. There's a you know there's a part of me that does feel upset by it all, obviously, Frankenstein, but absolutely not hopeless. I mean, I've never.
No, nor is Hölderlin, nor is Wordsworth, nor is Hegel. You know, that generation, they just follows a fairly similar trajectory.
Yeah,
That when they were in the teens and twenties, there's this intense sense of optimism that has to come to terms with disappointment, all sorts of disappointments as it progresses into adult life. When did you first sort of where one of the reasons you feel is one of the reasons you feel so connected to Hölderlin, do you think partly to do with the time and place you read it?
I did. Oxford had this special subject, well, that is to say, particular authors that you could study more than the rest of your curriculum, and I'd heard of him and read bits, and I said I would like to do that as my special
Okay.
subject, and I did it, and then I decided I wanted to write about him for my um, PhD DPhil thesis, and I got particularly there was this lovely guy, Professor Stahl. There were three Jewish emigres professors in Oxford, and Stahl was one of them. And he was a great lover of Hölderlin. And actually, when he was dying, I went and read Hölderlin to him in hospital again. So there were these terrific connections with a previous generation who really had it very difficult and had overcome things that must have been just terrible to try even to get over.
Mm.
That's not been the case in our family touch
Mm.
wood so far. And I don't think it will be. I think there's an awful lot in place, which is um, it, it's not all that far off with Gaza and Ukraine, clearly, but the European Union and our stupidity in getting out of it, being pulled out of it, there is things are in place which I hope and trust really will. Um, I mean, the thought of just sort of abandoning your kids into saying, "Well, cheerio, it's been lovely for us, but not it's not going to be so well for you." I don't think like that.
Mm.
Um, it's this what they call Prinzip Hoffnung, um, um, which is absolutely necessary, isn't it? And we had very good. We used to edit my Ellen, who's just been in this modern poetry and translation magazine, which was founded by Ted Hughes in 1966, when everything seemed to be coming apart in quite a good way because all of those zones occupied by Russia and the Soviet Union, there were obviously there were upsurges against them, and it seemed as though the whole structure was breaking. The wall came down and the rest of it, and it would be a better Europe that we'd be in. And in fact, I was in Tübingen when there was an awful lot of student protest in and a long, I mean, it's kind of daily march somewhere or other, and then Rudi Dutschke was shot and all the rest of it. And so it's a fervent sort of times with a feeling that the 60s were like things becoming better slowly for blacks in America and and even South Africa looking increasingly kind of not a place that was going to last much longer. I mean, it has, I know, but if you see what I mean, there's this sort of
Mm.
surge of
Mm.
hope.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting going back to Faust for a moment. Some people say it sort of represents a kind of the Goethe site the time of his existence, he lived through a similar time to these other characters, but saw the rise and the fall. And uniquely, Faust is composed across all these periods, which makes it a sort of, the longevity of it itself is interesting, even if the order is all scrambled. But do you think we can get out of Faust any kind of optimistic message? It's so ironic and it's so scandalous. But is that final scene with Gretchen's apparent forgiveness, can we see any of that to be earnest, even if the man who receives it is not deserving whatsoever? Is there a kind of love prevails idea in there, or is that wishful thinking of my own?
I don't think it's wishful thinking. I think it's one of the possibilities. And that you could say that's the good and the bad thing about a lot of irony. The good, if you again back to Keats, if you hold these opposites together like that, and you see the possibility of either. Losing my words now. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a possibility of that, and in a sense, it's up to the reader then to see which way the balance is tilting, and that's a text. In many ways, it's up to us which way the balance is tilting. What kind of citizens are we? What kind of people do we elect to lead us? All that is absolutely necessary, and that's why it's important to, as you probably know, the UK is bringing the voting age down to 16, and I think that's a good thing because that generation is still actually hopeful. It's
Not the ones I know. Very pessimistic teenagers. Yeah.
You've got a very narrow view of it, with our grandchildren.
Yeah. I yeah. I'm a little bit scared of the kids, of people younger than me. I hope this doesn't become a running theme as I get older. But yeah. The screens. I think we're kind of winding up now. Thank you again so much for joining us, David. At the end of our interview, we always ask our guest, what book would you sort of add to the biblical canon, meaning that billions of people all over the earth every Sunday hear a little bit of this text.
That's like Desert Island Discs.
Exactly, yeah. But it's for other people, not for you.
I've read so much and with such pleasure. There's one thing I'd like to say about that just before we
Go on.
it pertains to that. We had two very close friends. The husband has died, and his wife Lottie was Danish originally, and they were our closest friends in Durham when I was teaching there, and Helen was teaching there as well. And Lottie once just said, apropos of nothing really, that she's reading. She just said, "I'm reading Middlemarch again." And I thought, "Oh, that's nice." And she said, "Yeah, I read it periodically." We suddenly thought, that's what a book is. The text on the page is exactly the same. Nothing has been done to it. It's probably the same edition that Lottie always had with her. And she read it now, and then she read it then, and then she read it then. And that's, in a sense, that's what the good books do, is they are there, they're written, and nobody, normally speaking, is fiddling around with them. They are there, and it's you who's changing. And if when you read it the second time, you don't just say, "Oh, I missed that," you are a different person reading that same text, not wholly different by any means. But that is what I don't see you could take any book with you to a desert island. You have to take one like Middlemarch. But it would be something that bears, where there's a kind of discourse going on between you and the book, and you are open. That's critically important. You are open to things which you just hadn't realized, noticed, and been able to hack so far, and now suddenly you can't.
Yeah. Me and Milo both big Middlemarch fans.
Yeah, it would make the
Yeah.
Bible a lot larger, but that's not a problem.
That's a good idea. There's quite a
Yeah,
lot of.
It's
Well,
canon now. All the councils have agreed.
yeah.
Middlemarch is in.
no.
It-
I was just thinking about the Bible because the Song of Songs is quite something.
yeah, read the Robert Alter translation.
Oh,
It's glorious. Yeah, it's the most sensual one uh, composed in English.
yeah,
Yeah,
excellent. Well, I wish you both best of luck in all things, and
And
yeah,
yourself?
you know,
yeah.
it's been great.
A pleasure.
Bye
Thanks a
bye.
lot. Bye
Bye bye.
bye.
Bye bye.
Goodbye.